Father Wendall Verrill from St. Mary's Parish here in Waltham. Would like to take you on a little historical tour of this very interesting parish. The first Mass was recorded here in 1830, and appropriately on the 4th of July. We have our flag in the background to remind us of that. The Mass was celebrated probably for a group of French and Irish people, small group no doubt, by a Father O'Flaherty and a Father French with 2 F's no less. But the history is fascinating, especially of the early years. In order to really begin it, though, we have to move down the road a piece to about a block away to the corner of school and church, and there we really begin the history from 1830 to now of St. Mary's Parish, which served not just Waltham, but it was really the beginning of the Catholic community here in the Metro West area. So come on with me down to the corner here, and we'll talk a little bit more about the early days of St. Mary's. On August 25th, a Mr. Daniel Callahan bought this property, which is the site of the old Central Junior High School, for something like $65. Hard to believe. He got, a few acres, I guess. Basically, the deed was described thus. David Townsend sold the land to one Benedict Fenwick, who also was the Bishop of Boston at the time, and it was described as being north of the Great Road to Boston. That'll be Main Street, 1 block over there. Okay, north of the Great Road to Boston, and beginning at a line on the southwest corner of said land at a point where a picket board fence meets the townway leading from the Great Road aforesaid to a townway leading from the said Great Way to Lexington, which would be Lexington Street. So we're more or less right where that picket fence was. And it runs east by said fence down to some 13 rods and 15 links to a stake and stones. Well, obviously a stake and stones, they're not there anymore, but it's roughly down to a point of 70 feet, maybe 80 feet from here over to where the beginning of the school is. And then from there it runs down through that section where the school is now, all the way down almost to where point where the vocational high school is now. And that was the site of St. Mary's Church, purchased, as I said, on August 25th by Daniel Callahan. The whole property here was little less than an acre. Bishop Fenwick came out in 1831 to celebrate Mass in the first Catholic church built on this spot. And here's how the bishop's secretary described our first church. The church is not yet finished. It is, however, covered in, roughly weatherboarded only. It has the first floor complete with windows and doors, a sufficient number of benches for the accommodation of a good number of people. Its dimensions are 50 feet by 35 feet, and when finished, will be a very decent church. Well, the church continued to grow and develop, and visiting priests came out to say Mass at the little church right here on the corner of School and Church Street. And after a while, it was begun to be realized that it was time to make this a regular parish, a real parish. And so, on December 8th, 1839, St. Mary's Parish came into being, named on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, as were most of the churches of that time. The other personage who got a lot of play was St. Patrick. So the early churches were either named after St. Mary or St. Patrick. But trouble was brewing at St. Mary's, not just St. Mary's in Waltham. There was no trouble here yet, but at St. Mary's in the North End and St. Mary's in Salem. All sorts of trouble. Those Irish were fighting with each other and causing all sorts of difficulties. And 2 priests in particular were causing a great deal of problems. One was named Father Strain. We'll hear more about him in a minute. And Father Strain and others were creating such a difficulty that when Vesper services were begun one particular day at St. Mary's in the North End, the preacher was shouted out of the pulpit. Can you imagine getting away with that today? He was shouted down, "We want the other guy." And so the problem priest was sent to Salem, and then he was sent to Worcester, and eventually landed right here in St. Mary's. This particular site, which looks like a large parking lot now grassed over, is exactly that, a large parking lot now grassed over. You can see behind me the Technical High School, but this was originally designed right beside the church to be a parking lot for the parishioners. Ultimately, it would become a graveyard, but at the time, in the 1840s, the parishioners wanted this as a place to park their carriage, and thereby hangs a real tale in the history of St. Mary's. What had happened was Father O'Flaherty, the fellow that said the first Mass here, had been in the North End and had been sent up to Salem, keep him out of sight of the North Enders who were against him. And Father Strain, the famous Father Strain, Strain by name and Strain by nature, was sent to Worcester. And shortly thereafter, he wound up right back here in 1842 in St. Mary's in Waltham. By 1844, they were screaming for his head because he wanted to build his rectory, his parish house, right here on this spot, which the people were using to park their carriages. And they were furious because they needed a place to park their horses, their carriages. They were coming from Weston, they were coming from Waltham, they were coming from Watertown and all the surrounding territories, and he was taking the only, you would think, the only spot. I mean, my goodness, there was nothing else out here in those days, but anyway, he wanted it for a rectory, they wanted it for a parking lot, they also wanted it for a cemetery. They certainly said he should find a house somewhere else. The situation was exacerbated by the personality of Father Strain, which was, to say the least, straining. And the people were so angry with him that the bishop had to intercede. Father Strain's principal supporter was a man named Michael Rogers, and he turned against him in 1846 and created an insurrection. The doors of the church were closed, and a group of Strain's followers came to try to open the church again. The bishop now had interdicted the parish. In other words, the bishop had closed the doors of the church because there was so much fighting going on in the little parish community, mostly with those Irish Catholics, among themselves. And so he said, until you can settle your differences with the pastor and everybody else, you're going to have no church at all. You can get yourselves over to Watertown for Mass. At any rate, Rogers and Strain were now enemies. They met here on the front door, and fists flew. They were duking it out on the front door of the church. The sheriff came. Waltham Revisited rediscovered tells us that they had a cannon, and they had to fire a cannon to send everybody scurrying. The result was that the church was closed again, and it stayed closed until 1847. Strain was shipped out. Things calmed down. And finally the doors opened with a nice new pastor, a great guy. Everybody loved him, Patrick Flood. He thought it was all set, and it was all set, until 1848 when somebody burned the church down. Yep, June 4th, 1848 to be precise, somebody burned the place down. At first, the Know-Nothings were blamed. That was a political organization of rabid anti-Catholics who really had nothing, absolutely nothing, that they knew about except how to hate Catholics. And that's where they got their name, the Know-Nothing Party. But there was always a thought, and there still is today, and I have a suspicion, that it might have been burned down by the disgruntled faction of our own parish. There were a few folks who were unhappy that their side didn't win, and they may well have torched the place. At any rate, that's been the history of the church here in the Archdiocese as well as in St. Mary's. It is a little unusual to us to think back in those days that so many unchristian things happened in this Christian community. But unfortunately, it's not just St. Mary's, it's elsewhere in the Archdiocese. And if we had time, we could go into more recent events with the newer groups that have moved in to different parishes in the diocese. But at any rate, it was the case that there were often strong factions, and they often forgot their Christian teaching while they were trying to found Christian communities. Curious indeed. Well, we got a lot of assistance from unusual places. The town fathers offered town hall to say Mass, and we also got help from a very unusual source, some very interesting people. They're just down the street here. Come on down and I'll tell you a little bit more about them. Yes, indeed. The same people who'd sold us the property in 1830 were now in 1848 offering to loan us their church so that we could celebrate Mass. And this was most unusual because these people are the folks who now reside in this particular property, which is right beside the original property. It's the Second Religious Society of Waltham, known as the Unitarians, and they split off from the First Religious Society, whom we know as Congregationalists. The split is because the Unitarians had some difficulty believing in the Trinity, obviously. Some argue that it really was kind of a working class thing, that the newly arrived people were not being as well received at the Congregational Church as the landed gentry were, and that perhaps there was a little bit of class consciousness in this split. Who knows? I certainly don't know. I'm not a professional historian. I do know that you get a little bit of that even today in some of our parishes, perhaps even our own. At any rate, the Unitarians were most kind. First, in selling a piece of their property for us, we would be right across the street from them if we'd stayed on that property, and then offering to give us their church so that we could say Mass, loan us their church so that we could say Mass. A most generous group. In the history of the Archdiocese of Boston, the Ursuline Convent in Charlestown was burned down in, I believe, 1834 exactly. Here's a quote from the Unitarian newspaper of the time, the Christian Examiner, talking about this burning down of the Ursuline Convent by bigots. Our feelings, the Unitarian paper says, may be regarded as wholly unbiased when we say that under the outrage which has been perpetuated, the Catholics among us have displayed upon Christian principles a degree of forbearance which does them the highest honor. The religion which has suffered and the fanaticism of the guilty stand out in striking contrast to each other. Which sort of spirit is it desirable should prevail? Some nice comments from a tradition which is about as opposite the Catholic tradition as one possibly can be. But that position and that tradition has prevailed from that time to now. And we thank God for that, and we hope it continues for many more years. The little church was rebuilt in 1849, but still the problems persisted. Some people even objected to the pastor's salary. Can you believe that? Others objected to pew rent. They wanted to have a big meeting, but the bishop called their bluff, and no one showed up. And so the crisis passed. Fortunately, their pastor, Father Flood, was very good. He weathered all storms, so much so that by 1858 he was ready to start building the present St. Mary's Church at 145 School Street. Let's take a walk over there now, and we'll continue our story on the site of the current church. Services continued in the little church on Church Street for a while, but by 1863 the people were having Mass celebrated here in the uncompleted church being built by Father Patrick Flood. Here's a picture of the church, and check out the rectory beside it. Now, Father Strain would certainly be happy with a building as elegant as that. But as you can see in the picture, the church is well underway, but of course it's only part of the church that we know today. The last part was built after the demise of Father Patrick in 1863. Father Patrick Flood's successor in 1863 was his cousin, Father Bernard Flood. Father Bernard completed the church, and here is a shot of the interior in the 1860s. But the Irish were coming in huge numbers, and that church was becoming too small very quickly. So Father Bernard shortly decided to expand the church. He knocked down the back wall where the sanctuary was, and he expanded into this area here, which is now the current transept and sanctuary of the new church, the church of the 1870s. He created one of the largest churches for that time in the Archdiocese of Boston. The side transept area is 85 feet long. The front to back is 185 feet long. The main aisle is 150 feet long, something treasured by brides for over a century. It was a magnificent edifice. Here's a shot of the interior of the church when it was completed. Everyone notices the large white background with the three statues. And they became the focal point of people's worship until the 1960s, when liturgical renewal required more focus on the actual altar. The altar is a table which symbolizes the Eucharistic meal, and that is what's emphasized today. The background is a reredos. It's not really part of the altar itself, but the greatest single complaint of parishioners over the years is the loss of that large white background. The 5 statues and parts of that background have been relocated to other sections of the church. It was quite a monument. A monument to the Lord. Perhaps you could even consider it a monument to Father Patrick and Father Bernie Flood. We're up here in the choir loft. The reason we're here in the choir loft is because 5 days before Christmas in 1876, Father Bernie Flood came up to take a look at his work, see how the project was going. And while he was up here, took a fatal heart attack, died right here in the choir loft of the church that he was almost finishing. So 5 days before Christmas, 1876, the parishioners had a tough time because what a way to spend Christmas. Nevertheless, the church was completed the following year and stands today as a monument to the diligence of 2 cousins, Father Patrick and Father Bernie Flood, and of course their dedication, their service to the people of God and Jesus Christ. The death of Father Flood at the early age of 48 was quite a blow to the parish, especially at that holy season of the year. But shortly afterwards, the parish received one of the greatest pastors it's ever had, Father Timothy J. Brosnahan. Father Brosnahan was the pastor here for 42 years. He started in 1877, he ended in 1919, and he's pretty much responsible for the modern St. Mary's that we see. One of his first achievements was he saw the need for a larger, more substantial rectory, and so began building that immediately. And in 1888, this substantial structure was completed, and the priests moved into it. The old rectory was moved to another part of the property. Father Brosnahan went on to build the schools, St. Joseph's School, and a number of other things. He brought the sisters in. He did a tremendous amount of work. He was a bit of an interesting person. Many people remember and have anecdotes about him. We have one parishioner that remembers the time that she walked across the field of grass, which was the parking lot in those days, and unfortunately the pastor saw her and chewed her out. She is 97 now, but she remembers that like it happened last week. Another story that a parishioner talks about is his grandparents, hearing his grandparents when he was a small child some time ago, referring to the pastor and complaining a little bit because the pastor had kind of a hobby. In those days, of course, people still had horses and carriages, and he had some of the finest horses and carriages around. But he also had horses that he raced at Sarasota Springs, which people weren't supposed to know about, but they did. At any rate, this particular gentleman, now mature, can remember as a child listening to his grandparents complain that most of the parish still had outhouses, but Brosnahan had tile stalls for his horses. And this is the carriage house, and sure enough, there's the tile, a little bit of the tile that's left from those days. Another one of the many accomplishments of Father Brosnahan was the purchase on High Street of the new Calvary Cemetery, the expansion basically of Calvary Cemetery. You remember the old Calvary Cemetery over on High Street, the problems with Father Strain and so forth. Here's a picture of what it probably looked like sometime in the early part of this century. At any rate, Father Brosnahan recognized that there was no way that that little cemetery was going to handle all the people from St. Mary's, so he bought the property on High Street and expanded it, and that became the new Calvary Cemetery. Now this is going to be hard to believe, but as early as 1881, Father Brosnahan and the parishioners were arguing to move the bodies at Calvary Cemetery, Old Calvary, over to the new cemetery. Now that didn't happen. 1881 they started talking about. That didn't happen until the 1940s. We still have parishioners who remember watching them, looking out the window of the school and watching them dig up the graves and moving the bodies over to Old Calvary Cemetery. And even then, now they had stopped burying there for many years, but there was one elderly parishioner whose mother was buried in Old Calvary Cemetery and who never set foot in the church again because they moved his mother's bones, and he was absolutely bereft. You never know. You never know how people are going to be affected, and even though it has to be done, as we know from so many changes in the church today, it's still a difficult thing to have happen, and this particular parishioner was terribly discouraged and disillusioned, and you feel badly, but still, it has to happen. So these are some of the things that Father Brosnahan did in his 42 years here. A very, very astute administrator, a very accomplished man. We owe a lot to him even today. It's always helpful to review your notes from time to time. I was just glancing through this document, which is St. Mary's 150th year anniversary brochure, and I think I misspoke about the rectory. I think I said 1888. The rectory was done in 1883. It was one of Father Brosnahan's first accomplishments. But this was once the site of the first parochial school, St. Joseph's. For some reason, they named it St. Joseph's Parochial School. Work was begun here in 1886. About all you can see left of it is a depression in the parking lot where, after the building was taken down, filled land was put in, and of course the filled land has settled over the years. But this was once the powerhouse of a parochial school. St. Joseph's Parochial School opened its doors in 1888. It really was something else. It was a brick building, 115-foot front, 85 feet in the back, 26 feet from Pond Street. First and second floors had 6 rooms each, and the third floor had 4 schoolrooms and a large hall. Accommodations, if you can believe this, for 900 pupils. They really must have been in there kind of tight, because 900 pupils in that building was quite a large number. So it was quite an event to have this building begun. And of course they had to have the sisters coming, and the sisters had to have a place to live. And here we are at the old convent, now the religious education building. Let's go on inside and take a look, see what's there today. The original St. Mary's Convent was a wooden building and held more than 20 sisters. This building, rather echoey and large, was built in 1923 and housed 30 sisters. Now you can imagine they lived in small cells, 30 sisters, 1 bathroom for each floor, common rooms. How incredibly difficult that must have been. And yet they lived together for decades in peace, relative peace and harmony. Imagine the forbearance, the patience that must have taken. Community life was not easy, ever. And you know the kinds of lives, many of you, that they lived, how strict and disciplined those lives were. Some of you received a little discipline as a result, perhaps, of the lives that the sisters and the brothers lived. At any rate, in 1889, the sisters began. The following year, Father Brosnahan bought property on Newton Street, which is currently the Marist Nursing Home, but was then the novitiate for the Notre Dame Sisters. And of course the Notre Dame Sisters have trained thousands, literally thousands of girls and boys here in Waltham. So their contribution has been really something very, very significant for Waltham, the union between that particular convent and the sisters. But at the same time, along came the Christian Brothers. We'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. And they began teaching the boys. So the school was divided into the girls' side and the boys' side. Huge, packed school, classes going on in the church, going on wherever they could find space. It was an extraordinary situation, and it was going to take a while before new buildings were built to accommodate them all. Let's go on upstairs to the chapel. We'll talk a little bit more about the school situation and the general community life here in Waltham. This is the chapel of the 1923 convent. Obviously, it's been modernized. We just finished it last year. In the old days, it was the traditional style with all the benches facing the principal altar. The 30 sisters would gather here every morning and every afternoon and every evening and pray. And Lord knows they needed those prayers. Don't forget, even before that, they were jammed into a smaller wooden convent, even more difficult to live. And yet somehow they made it, and somehow they taught thousands and thousands of our young people. Just listen to these stats for 1912. 750 girls, 580 boys. Can you imagine? Jammed into that one building, meeting in this church, meeting wherever they could. Father Brosnahan died in 1919. His successor was Father James Baxter. He stayed until 1935. Father Baxter moved in and saw right away we had to get more space quick. So he built the St. Mary's High School, which opened its doors for the first time in 1923 with the help of the Christian Brothers. That, of course, relieved some of the space needs and, of course, allowed even more young people to be educated here on the grounds and under the aegis of St. Mary's. Let's go over there now. It's a little tough today, but let's see what it looks like. What you are is God's gift to you. What you become is your gift to God. Those words have probably been there since 1973, because that's when we closed St. Mary's High School. We're standing on the second floor. It's not been used since it was closed. The only thing the building was used for was bingo on Saturday night and various meetings. The Heritage Hall is still active. The first floor is pretty much for bingo. But the building has been in disuse and falling into disrepair, as you can imagine. The outside is bad enough, but the inside, especially this floor, is even worse. And so we know that we've had to do something with it, and we've decided to make elderly housing. We're fortunate enough to get a grant from the government to make elderly housing in this building and build one next to it, which will be brand new. So in the next year or so, we want to see this building renewed and put into new use again. It's a great tradition, St. Mary's, 1923 to 1973. You can't go anywhere without bumping into a St. Mary's graduate. It's amazing, amazing, the tremendous number of young people who went through here. What a powerhouse it was in its day. But those days are over. Declining enrollments, no money, no sisters, no brothers. We owe a great debt of gratitude to the Christian Brothers for their service to the school over the years. It meant that we had to close the school. Father Corkery had to announce the closing, but Father Saunders, I think, was the final person to close the doors. So soon it will be a new building, renewed, and we look forward to that. In the meantime, we celebrate the years that it was active in the community. We have one more stop to make before we end this little history of St. Mary's. This particular image is the image of St. John. But St. John in Spanish is San Juan. That's part of the shield, the medal of San Juan, Puerto Rico. So it's very appropriate that it's here, because no sooner had Father Saunders gotten over the debate about closing the high school than he was embroiled in yet another debate. The Hispanic community, which had been here since 1960s, early 60s, migrating down from the farms where they'd begun to work, were settling in Waltham, and mostly Puerto Ricans, and they wanted a place to worship. Father Jim McDonald and others were saying Mass for them in the old French church and in other places, but in '68, Father McDonald began saying Mass for them here in the chapel of St. Mary's Church. But Father McDonald left in '74 and then began a debate, because most of the Hispanics lived on the south side, and Father Saunders thought it would be more appropriate if they were to go back to St. Charles. The Hispanics wanted none of that. And so the debate continued until finally they appointed Father Leon Beauvais as curate. He was later to come back as a pastor in 1985 and last until 1994. We have a great history of serving many different ethnic communities. We pray God it will continue for years to come. And we'll leave you now with a few views of our very attractive stained glass windows.